Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And now finally, we're going to be talking about the self-titled debut album from Casualties of Cool. Now there are some records that the second you hear about them, you just know on some level they're gonna work, or at least they should work, at least for me. Maybe it's the people behind them, the concept, the genre fusion. You just got that feeling in your gut that on some level, this is gonna kick all amounts of ass. And really, the fact that I'm only getting to this now is more a little bit embarrassing for me. It's a side project that Canadian extreme metal artist Devin Townsend has long dreamed about. The beginnings of Casualties of Cool started in 2010 as a pairing between himself and Amy Dorval, a spacey country blues ambient blend that promised one of Devin Townsend's most ambitious stories yet. And keep in mind, this is the guy who wrote Ziltoid the Omniscient, a space opera that featured a dimension-bending alien searching for the meaning of existence and the perfect cup of coffee. In other words, I had to make time to hear this album. Half because it's Devin Townsend and he's awesome, and half because I'm still one of only a few critics on YouTube that really talks about country music in any capacity. And this looked to be right up my alley. So okay, why did it take me so long to talk about it? Honestly, this is a case of me completely forgetting about this album when it dropped initially and struggling to find time to really wedge it in. And part of it was beyond some scattered albums, I still hadn't really taken the time to delve deeper into Devin Townsend's entire discography. But now that I've had the great pleasure of doing that, and since I've already covered Devin Townsend projects twice this year, why not make it a hat trick with Casualties of Cool? So I finally took the time to really delve deep into this self-titled album. What do we get here? Well, I can say this definitively. The self-titled record from Casualties of Cool will not be like anything else you have heard this entire year. Hell, I don't think I've ever quite heard an album like this, blending elements of country, blues, ambient music, progressive rock, and even sputtering moments of glitch and electronica. It's the sort of record that is defiantly its own entity, but it's not forceful about it. The sort of subtle, spacious, vaguely unsettling record that is gorgeously organic and yet very tightly regimented. A difficult listen if only because empty spaces defined like this are intimidating for any stretch of time because they demand to be filled. Oh, and if you can't tell by now, this album is goddamn incredible. One of the best records of the year, hands down, that outstrips anything Devin Townsend has released in a long time and highlights his insane talent as a composer, producer, and songwriter. I was expecting to like this album going in, but I wasn't expecting to like it like this. I was not expecting an album like this, that's for damn sure. In other words, this is amazing. And you know what? I'm almost at a loss of where to start, so let's begin with the simplest element. The vocals. The pairing of Townsend with Dorval is inspired, mostly because they play off each other with a distinctly unique way. Townsend's voice isn't precisely country, especially as a rich, smooth tenor that is perfectly multi-tracked, and yet it still gently fills the mix and is a perfect counterbalance to Dorval's more country tones, which vary between strident and poised to achingly poignant and emotive. And the vocal production is goddamn phenomenal too. In comparison with most country music, there are more vocal synthetic effects, both in reverb and some lo-fi segments, but when the rich baritone choir comes in unbroken, it's startling how well every single voice is perfectly placed within the mix. The swell that feels grandiose without ever becoming overbearing. It also makes for incredible contrast when Devin Townsend does let loose some of his more familiar, rougher vocals later on the album for moments of perfectly timed, glorious impact. And while the mix balance has always been a strength of Devin Townsend's production, it's been a while since I've heard him this on his game all across the board. Casualties of Cool is a record that demands subtlety and patience, using the country tones for steadily chugging grooves that produce the skeleton for the ambient textures and the melodies for this album, the drums keeping their restrained and brittle yet ruthless cadence. And all of it is intensified by a mix that has the massive size of any of Devin Townsend's metal records, where he can either overlay layer after layer into the wall of sounds for which he's famous in some of the album's most memorable moments, and then he can actually highlight the sweeping, desolate emptiness here too. The filmmaker Jim Jarmusch has made statements about how he always considered the pauses between words to be just as important, if not more important, than the words themselves. And here Devin Townsend follows a very similar approach. He's a rich, spacious mix, drawing all the more attention to the lonely melodies that echo out across the void, if and when they echo out at all. What this can mean is that this album can feel a little bit long at points, a little bit empty, especially during how some of the tracks fade into ambient sound, or the instrumental segments that take repetitive melodies and grooves and isolate them to intensify that atmosphere. And well, it sounds absolutely fantastic from a production standpoint and perfectly fits into the album's atmosphere. It could be argued that this record could afford to move just a little bit more quickly, pick up the pace just a little bit. But you know what? If you've got the patience for it, there are some absolutely incredible moments on this album. Townsend has cited a lot of comparisons to Johnny Cash, but he's not kidding here, especially in the electric tone for his grooves, starting innocuously enough with Daddy that despite Devin Townsend's cleaner production, still picks up a phenomenal amount of texture and a spacious country sound that's unlike anything else. The groove gets a lot darker and thicker on Mountaintop, especially as the bass gains more prominence in the eerie back half. I love the glitchy fragments and the ragged strings against the shimmering sounds of Flight, against the gorgeously smooth acoustic melodies and its subtle, ominous flavor courtesy of some of the minor keys in the melody there. How it gets even darker against the faded voices, against the more prominent groove that blends into a great guitar solo on the Code before landing in the muffled clatter of percussion against the bass groove, fluttering synth line, and saxophone leads on Moon. From there we get the windswept horns and tight acoustic groove on Either that break into this progressive drum solo, the thick drums of Heishta, the bluesy snarl on Forgive Me, the eerie, almost gothic feel of Bones, my favorite song, or the scratchy, jagged shards of Deathscope that's only ground in a solid melodic riff against the vocal snippets, ragged strings, blasts of distorted guitar and noise, and horns that break into these desiccated, lonely gasps courtesy of Townsend. And yet, the album still isn't done, fading into one of the more normal sounding country tunes with The Field, with a striking guitar solo against the backdrop of the strings and the acoustic strumming. Then there's the climatic swell, the bridge, and in a moment, that would be anticlimactic except for its lonely power in the flutes on the very closing song, Pure. Now, okay, I've gone on at length about the instrumentation on this record, but what about the songwriting? Well, like most of Devin Townsend's material, it's pretty vaguely sketched, and that can get kind of hard to parse out the details of this story, which is reportedly about a man lured to a sentient planet, and after discovering a radio and an old phonograph, he confronts his fear, frees his soul, and is able to escape. You'd be forgiven for not getting that at all after multiple listens to this album, because even though it's certainly sparse on some of the details, you can tell there is a story here. But even with this story, it's a tough sell, mostly because Devin Townsend is the sort of songwriter to leave details up to interpretation, or let the mix show rather than tell in the lyrics. And I'll give him this, he does a damn good job selling that sense of loneliness and being adrift in the void. The subtlety of being lured into space being played remarkably well with every single masked word, facing an entity that seems far larger and far more implacable and powerful than yourself. By now, you should have already guessed that the obvious themes here about confronting fear, the entity that can feel like a whole sentient world against you, is often a subtle entrapment that paralyzes rather than outright attacks. This is a fear that lures the narrator through a chance to recapture his dreams and traps him through feelings of inadequacy and doubt in order to accomplish these dreams. And it wasn't until I reached Bones that I grasped a very subtle choice of Devin Townsend that is downright inspired for this album. See, for as lonely as this record feels, it's almost always composed of both Devin Townsend and Dwarval's vocals, though the only obvious moments being on Heishta and Forgive Me, implying that one might be from another speaker, either from the radio or from the phonograph. And yet on my fourth listen and a very deep read through the lyrics, I finally got it. For the majority of Casualties of Cool, Dwarval is representative of the narrator's fear. It's why she eggs him on the early tracks to get off to that sentient world, where her narration on Forgive Me presents feelings of despair, why she can't provide for her family, the embodiment of that fear. She is the main vocalist set on crushing Devin Townsend into the ground. And after Devin Townsend confronts his fear on Deathscope, Dwarval's vocals now represent the new woman that he is freed from deep within his mind, an acknowledgement of the root of his fears that lie in the pressure of parental figures early on, set to the story of The Field, where the overbearing parents often have more of a stake in their children's sports activities than the kids do, when the kids just want to daydream. And from there, the narrator gains the confidence to free himself from that weight of fear and rocket back into the void, with only the flute on Pure left playing, an ode to the sentient world that he is now left behind, all the more lonely, or of his own loneliness that he sees as an uncertain future going off into space. Either way, you know what? This album is goddamn awesome. Now let me stress, it's not going to be for everyone. Usual Devin Townsend fans who aren't a fan of his more ambient work will likely find this a little too slow, quiet, and empty to really grip them, and country fans will likely be put off by some of the spacier production and some of the glitchy effects around the edges. But if you can find that middle ground, you will find a record that is subtle, beautiful and heartbreakingly powerful, and easily one of the best of the year. It's a goddamn crime I did not get to this sooner, but I'm here about it now. 9 out of 10, a high recommendation, and for anyone who has the patience for over an hour of ambient country blended with progressive rock, hell, anyone who just loves great goddamn music, get them this album. If you haven't heard the self-titled album from Casualties of Cool just yet, I highly recommend this. It might be overlooked by most as just an idle side project, but I promise it is definitely worth the listen. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Seriously, folks, check this out before the end of the year. It's amazing. I'm so happy I got a chance to get to it. But if there's any other albums you want me to get to before the end of the year, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.